For over 1,000 years, the walls of Constantinople had never been broken. Emperors had thrown armies at them. Empires had laid siege and starved outside them. The triple line of Theodosian stone had turned back everyone who ever tried for 10 centuries. And then, in the spring of 1453, they fell in 53 days. The weapon that brought them down was not forged by a general. It did not belong to a great strategist or a braver army. It began as a powder mixed 700 years earlier by Chinese alchemists who were not trying to win a war at all. They were trying to cheat death. They were searching for the secret to eternal life. This is not the story of a weapon. It is the story of how the search for immortality produced the machine that killed an entire age. The age of the castle. The age of the knight. The age of the man in armor on horseback who, for 1,000 years, had decided who ruled and who knelt. All of it ended, not by a better sword, not by a bigger army, but by a gray powder in a metal tube. It wasn't the taller wall. It wasn't the bigger army. It was the powder. And to understand how it toppled the greatest walls in the world, you have to go back to where it began, in a Chinese laboratory, in the hands of men looking for the opposite of what they found. It began in China, sometime around the 9th century, during the Tang dynasty. Taoist alchemists spent their lives searching for an elixir, a mixture that would grant eternal life. They ground together minerals, herbs, and salts, testing combination after combination, chasing a formula that would let a man live forever. Instead, they found a formula that could kill by the 1,000. One of the substances they worked with was saltpeter, potassium nitrate. On its own, it was a strange, bitter salt that formed on cave walls and old stone. But saltpeter has a hidden property. It carries its own oxygen, locked inside it. And that means a mixture built around saltpeter does not need the open air to burn. Sealed inside a container, cut off from the outside world, it burns anyway, all at once, faster than the eye can follow. Mixed with sulfur to lower the temperature it ignites at, and charcoal to feed the flame, saltpeter did something no other material of the ancient world could do. It did not just burn. Confined, it exploded. The first written record of the recipe appears around the year 808 in a Taoist text. The Chinese gave it a name that carries the whole irony of this story. They called it Huo Yao, fire medicine, a medicine, something born from the search for health and long life. The men who wrote that recipe were not arming a nation. They believed they were one step closer to living forever. For a while, it stayed a curiosity, used in fireworks, in signals, in temple rituals. But China in these centuries was not at peace. And when a technology that can explode meets an empire at war, it does not stay a curiosity for long. By the year 1044, the powder had a new home, the battlefield. In that year, a Song dynasty military manual called the Wujing Zongyao, the complete essentials for the military classics, recorded the first gunpowder formulas, written down for war. Compiled under the scholar Zheng Gongliang, it laid out mixtures that were roughly half saltpeter, enough to burn ferociously, though not yet to explode at full force. The secret was no longer alchemy. It was ordnance. Then the Chinese did something that changed the shape of every war that followed. They put the powder in a tube. The first true firearm was not a cannon. It was the fire lance, a spear with a tube of bamboo, and later, paper or metal, lashed to the end. Packed with gunpowder and scraps of iron, it spat a cone of flame and shrapnel into the face of anyone in front of it. In the long, grinding wars between the Song dynasty and the Jin, both sides used it and improved it. By 1232, Jin soldiers were carrying fire lances with barrels made of 16 layers of tough paper, loaded with charcoal, iron fragments, sulfur, and saltpeter. From that burning tube came the idea that would define warfare for the next 700 years. If a tube could throw fire, a stronger tube could throw a projectile. Make the barrel out of metal, pack the powder tight behind a ball, and you have a gun. The oldest surviving firearm in the world proves how early this happened. It is a small bronze hand cannon, unearthed in the Heilongjiang province of China, and dated to no later than 1288. It weighs just 3.5 kilograms. It is 34 centimeters long. It sits today in a museum in Harbin, a stub of corroded bronze that is, quietly, the ancestor of every gun ever fired since. China had invented the future of war, but China was not where that future would be unleashed. For that, the powder had to travel, and it traveled on the largest empire the world had ever seen. In the 13th century, the Mongols swept out of the steppe and conquered from the Pacific coast of China to the gates of Eastern Europe. They absorbed the gunpowder weapons of the peoples they conquered, and they carried that knowledge west along the roads of their empire. The same roads that carried silk and spice and plague. Gunpowder was one more cargo on the Silk Road, moving from the country that invented it toward the continent that would weaponize it beyond anything its makers imagined. By around 1326, the powder had reached Western Europe, and we know the date because of a book. In that year, an English scholar named Walter de Millemate finished a treatise on kingship, written for the young prince who would become King Edward III. In the margin of one page, almost as decoration, there is a drawing. A soldier stands beside a strange vase-shaped object lying on a table. It is a pot de fer, an iron pot, and from its mouth flies a large arrow aimed at a fortified gate. It is the first known picture of a cannon in Europe. That manuscript survives today at Christ Church, Oxford. A single sketch in the corner of a book about how to be a good king, and it is the opening image of the end of the medieval world. Because once Europe had the powder, it did what China had not fully done. It made the cannon the centerpiece of war, and the cannon had one purpose above all others. It was a machine built to break walls. For 1,000 years, the wall had been the master of war. A high stone wall meant safety. It meant that a small force could hold off a large one, that a lord in his castle could defy a king, that a city could outlast an empire simply by closing its gates and waiting. Siege was slow, brutal, and usually a matter of starvation, not assault. An attacker could try to climb the wall with ladders and die on top of it. He could try to break the gate with a battering ram and be crushed from above. He could dig under the foundations, or he could simply sit outside for months and wait for the city to run out of food. But he almost never knocked the wall down. The wall almost always won. The cannon changed the physics of the problem. A battering ram strikes the same spot again and again with the muscle of men. A cannon strikes it with the force of an explosion, a boulder driven into stone faster than any ram could ever move. What had taken an army months of starvation could now be done in days of bombardment. The wall that had been a shield became a target, big, fixed, and impossible to hide. For the first time in history, an attacker could simply break his way in, and nowhere did the wall fall more completely than at Constantinople. By 1453, Constantinople was the last capital of the Byzantine Empire, the 1,000-year continuation of Rome in the east. Its greatest defense was its walls, the Theodosian walls, a triple line of stone and moat first raised in the 5th century. They had held for a millennium. They had turned back Persians, Arabs, Bulgars, and Rus. As long as those walls stood, the city stood. Facing them was a 21-year-old Ottoman Sultan, Mehmed II. And Mehmed had understood something his enemies had not. The wall was no longer master. The powder was. His weapon arrived in the form of a man, a cannon founder named Orban. Orban was Hungarian, a mercenary of the new science of artillery, and he had a design for a bombard larger than anything ever cast. He offered it first to the defenders of Constantinople, to the Byzantine Emperor Constantine XI. But the emperor's treasury was nearly empty, and he could not pay what Orban asked. So Orban crossed the lines and offered his cannon to the Sultan instead. Mehmed paid. The hidden factor that decided the fall of the thousand-year city was not an army. It was a single engineer, sold to the highest bidder. What Orban built was a monster. His great bombard was around 8 meters long, 27 feet, and weighed close to 19 tons of bronze. Its walls were nearly 20 centimeters thick to contain the blast. It fired stone balls weighing hundreds of pounds. It was cast in a foundry and then dragged over more than 200 kilometers to the walls of the city, hauled by 60 oxen and hundreds of men. It was so large and so experimental that during the siege, it cracked from the force of its own firing and had to be repaired on the spot. The siege began on the 6th of April, 1453, and day after day, the guns did what no army in 1,000 years had done. They pounded the ancient stone, they brought down towers, they opened gaps in walls that had never been breached. The Theodosian walls had been built to stop men and ladders and battering rams. They had never been designed to stand against a weapon that could throw a boulder through solid stone. On the 29th of May, 1453, after 53 days the city fell. The last Roman emperor died fighting in the breach. 1,000 years of empire ended. And they ended because a powder invented by monks looking for eternal life had been cast into a cannon by a mercenary looking for a paycheck. The fall of Constantinople was not just the end of an empire. It was the announcement to all of Europe of a new law of war. The wall no longer saved you, and if the wall could not save a 1,000-year capital, it could not save anyone. What followed was the slow death of the world the wall had built. High, thin castle walls, the pride of every medieval lord, became targets instead of shields. The great stone keep, once the safest place on earth, was now the easiest to hit. Across Europe, the castle stopped being a fortress and started becoming a home because a fortress it could no longer be. And it was not only the castle that died, it was the knight. For 1,000 years, the armored knight on horseback had been the most expensive and most decisive soldier on the field. Consider what a knight actually was. He was trained from boyhood, a decade or more learning to fight from the saddle. He was armored in plate that could cost as much as a small farm, mounted on war horses bred and priced like luxury goods. A single knight represented years of training and a fortune in equipment. That investment bought a warrior almost no common man could ever stand against. The whole social order of the Middle Ages was built on it. The lords who could afford to be knights ruled the men who could not. Gunpowder erased that in an afternoon. A metal tube, packed with powder, could be handed to a peasant with a few weeks of training, and that peasant could kill the most expensive soldier on the battlefield from a distance, before the knight's lance ever reached him, before the horse ever closed the gap. The armor that had made a man untouchable for 1,000 years became just heavier weight to carry toward the guns. A lifetime of training and a fortune in steel could be undone by a farmhand and a fistful of powder. The math of war had inverted. That is the true revolution of the powder. It did not just knock down walls, it flattened a 1,000-year hierarchy. The lord in his castle, the knight in his armor, their whole power rested on things gunpowder made worthless. The powder democratized death, and a world where any trained man could kill any other was no longer a world the knight could rule. Here is the final irony. China invented gunpowder in the search for eternal life and used it for centuries in fireworks and fire lances. It was Europe that took the fire medicine and cast it into the weapon that smashed its own medieval world to pieces, that ended its castles, unseated its knights, and toppled the last walls of Rome. Every firearm that has ever been fired descends in a straight line from that gray powder. The musket, the rifle, the artillery of every war since, all of it is the same fire medicine, refined again and again. The logic that Orban proved beneath the walls of Constantinople is the same logic that still drives every arms race today. The right technology is worth more than the tallest wall and the largest army. So the next time you see a ruined castle wall, broken, roofless, standing open to the sky, look closely. You are not just looking at old stone. You are looking at what gunpowder made obsolete. You are looking at the moment the wall stopped winning. And you are looking at the beginning of every gun that came after. Born of all things from men who only wanted to live forever.